Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today we want to discuss a very interesting matter, which is about a specific country, but it is indicative of certain things that are happening in the world. And it's an important story for people. We're going to talk about Bangladesh today because there are things, the world has been changing and changing rapidly. While we have a picture of, for example, so-called third world countries and developing countries, which it goes back to the 70s and 80s, we don't really realize the massive change that is taking place. I mean, not only China, which people have the idea of China was a poor country. Now people realize China is no longer a poor country. It's an industrial nation. But we have, for example, cases like Ethiopia, Egypt. The image of Ethiopia is, the typical image of famine. The same that Egypt is a poor country, but the mass media in the West especially is not really covering what is happening in those countries. And this is an impediment to economic cooperation, actually, among nations. And the other thing is that when nations develop, this becomes a very interesting arena for the world, which is, we have a troubled world today, where nations are in conflict, can come together for economic development from the East, from the West, from the South, and from the North. So the story of Bangladesh is actually interesting. To discuss this matter, I have the honor to present our friend, Mr. Henry Tillman, founder of the China Investment Research. He has been with us several times in previous, and he is the man with the numbers. What he identifies in many countries in the world is there are indicators which we miss, the mass media misses, the so-called economic media misses, are very important investment data. They are rather small sometimes they are big, but they are not, they are missed by the general. But what these data, for example, for me, shows me an indication, a trajectory where things could be going in certain countries and certain parts of the world. So thank you, Henry, for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure being with you and to working with our friends at BRIX.
Thank you very much. Let us start from the inauguration of the Padma Bridge over the Padma River, which is called distributary of the mighty Ganges River. The inauguration of the bridge took place officially on June 25th, and it's a multi-purpose bridge, quite massive. It's 2 stories for rail and for motor vehicles, but it's also a very interesting because it's the largest bridge and the highest bridge on the Padma River, and also in Bangladesh. It is longer than 6 kilometers. It has 4 lanes, highway, and also a railway, as I said. And it cost more than $3 billion, actually. And it is one of the most challenging construction projects probably in Asia. Except for some projects in China, but also it was built by a Chinese company called Major Bridge Engineering Corporation, MBEC. But it's a very important economic aspect of Bangladesh, for the economic development of Bangladesh. It connects the capital in the northeast with the southeast of the country, but it's also considered as a link to India, but also to Myanmar and Southeast Asia and China in the east and northeast. But there are estimates that this bridge will increase the GDP of Bangladesh by 1.2% annually. So there are things happening in Bangladesh which we don't notice. The opening of the Padma Bridge was a big event. It was noticed, but it was not big news here in Europe, for example. But I noticed it. Many people in Asia noticed it. But there is a story behind this bridge. because it has certain implications. It means a lot for Bangladesh, but also for the world. And I think Henry has the background story on this, which he would like to tell us about.
Thank you. Yes, I would actually. I'm delighted to have met the Sheikha, and I'm delighted to see how she performed under difficult conditions.
You personally met with Sheikh Hasina?
Yes, I met with her here. I met with her and I met with the cabinet here at the House of Lords, and I met with her. I met with and one of my friends knows her quite well from the House of Lords, like one of my former work colleagues. And also I've met with most of the cabinet here, which is the genesis for our involvement as a firm and our involvement with the UK government into looking at it from our long-term relationship with them. So to the story you're referring to, yes, it's true that people are still tarred. Bangladesh is still tarred, unfortunately, with people's memory from the 1970s, which we don't go into. But I do want to tell the story about the Padma Bridge, because in 2012, the World Bank had agreed to finance the building of the Padma Bridge. But by 2014, they said, we're not going to do this because there's too much corruption. So the Sheikha took the time to actually call them on a dare and said, we're going to do this ourselves without any financing help. They choose construction help elsewhere, but not financing help, and call them out. And on New Year's Eve last year, she and her sister walked across the bridge. So yes, it's true that, and by the way, it was only 3 months late getting done. So that's not a bad performance. And so, that shows real, if you want to call it Brooklyn term, a chutzpah, basically, of being able to say, maybe no one believes me, or I don't, we've come a long way. And to pick up your point, Bangladesh is one of those countries that, despite the COVID, still showed growth, GDP growth. We're talking 7 to 8% per year pre-COVID, and even 2.5% per year during COVID. So the infrastructure things you're talking about, whether it's Padma Bridge or other bridges, are also going to add more to the GDP growth and help attract more capital to the country. In addition, you're absolutely spot on about connectivity with other countries, because some of these other projects, whether it's built by China, Japan, or Korea, or others, are also linkages specifically into parts of India, parts of Myanmar. Yes, so there's very strong linkages in these infrastructure projects. So we look at this twofold. We look at, as you say, the private sector movements, which we could talk about in much more detail, and because they are very positive, and also the infrastructure that you just raised, which are also quite positive for longer term growth.
You have studied the certain indicators and numbers on investments by different countries in Bangladesh, which would be interesting for our viewers to share with you. You can share it with them to figure out where things are going, or at least what is going on now in Bangladesh.
I think Bangladesh is just one country who's done a very good job of looking at multiple options. We see this press that's full of one versus another, one winner, one loser. That's not the way these countries are being run. This is all hype. Unfortunately, it's still more hype, which is why I do these things with you.
Zero-sum game. That's the problem.
I think there's lots of names for it, but we'll go with your name. I can think of other names for it.
We have to go from zero-sum game to win-win.
Well, and in fact, what's happening here. So in essence, if you look at just pure investment across the leading investments in 2021 were in fact Japan, China, Korea, and the Americas. But if you look at infrastructure investments or investments to date, you see Japan is by far the biggest investor in them. Yes. Now, even with 27 billion invested to date in Bangladesh. So even if, as you probably know from all the stuff you do with the Belt and Road, that the second biggest pledge back in 2016 was from President Xi to Bangladesh on these infrastructure projects of over 20 billion of debt. Actually, only less than 8 billion of that's been up to 2021. Now it's opening up now to balance it out, but there's so much misperception. So Japan had 4 times more, 3.5 times more investment than China has had in Bangladesh. Nobody talks about it. Japan knows about it, Korea knows about it. The USA knows about it. And what you're also seeing, because of the South Asia strategic fit, and you know this already, politically, it fits very nicely into the MENA region as well, right?
Middle
And the
East and North
natural
Africa.
and North Africa, yes. So linkages, the South Asia is integral not only to that corridor you're talking about, which is definitely true, but it also goes south as well. So this is a very key strategic country to get right.
I mean, there is a Belt and Road corridor, which is a concept. It's the China, Myanmar, Bangladesh, India. This is hopefully in the future will materialize. But as we discussed in a previous podcast this week on ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the amount of investments from the EU, for example, surpasses that of China, Japan, Korea, so the United States. So the thing is that there is no real conflict between East and West working together whether in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, wherever. It's not a zero-sum game. That's the big problem we have with these proposals, Build Back Better World and Global Gateway and these things, which are intentionally to block China. Everybody will benefit more, all sides will benefit more, and the host countries, if everybody comes together to invest and build.
And this is what we're seeing happening. So, and what you're talking about is what I call them the television foreign service, because the television and the media become foreign service. But so what you have is a situation where people are trying to spin stories and not tell facts, and they just have no interest in telling those facts, which is why what you're doing is terrific with respect to providing an audience to people. And if you will, it's not just that as well, but it's also other countries along. We're looking at Malaysia right now, same sort of mentality, blend. Egypt, blend.
Yeah.
So everyone looks at this as people working together. It just doesn't sell newspapers or television ads.
Right. But so let's look at the data, as you said. Let's look at the data to get instead of the propaganda. Just let me know.
If you just turn the slide, please. Do a couple of slides forward, if you will. Next slide, please. And then next slide, please. Here's what I was talking about in 2021. Look at the balance. Right? It's really led by Japan, then Korea. China's a smaller number, and Europe's even smaller number. Again, misperception. Multiples from Japan and Korea versus China and Europe. Next slide, please. And of course, pharma, solar, e-commerce, microfinance, these are not garment manufacturing. It's the future where the country's moving to. Thank you. Next slide, please. We discussed briefly some of the Japan infrastructure projects. There were 6 of them signed off in 2017. 3 of those are below. One's an airport project due in 23, a Ajika loan in 21 for, if you will, the mass transit in Dhaka, and a coal-fired power plant. Those are 3 of those. Again, these are major investments by Japan. Yes. And if you look at the bottom of the page in the box, that's the number I was talking about, says it all. So far, 27 billion assistance to Japan, from Japan to Bangladesh through 2021. Now, if we go to the next slide, China finance, look at the bottom of that slide. 7.8 billion versus 27 billion. Again, misperception. Yes. So in 2021, you see at the top, that's what you were talking about before, the elevated expressway, right? What you were talking about before, that's elevated. And then what you were talking about before, here are 4 different infrastructure projects. But these aren't big numbers. $1.2 billion and 700 million, it's a couple billion. These are not massive numbers like you just saw from Japan. Yes. Next slide, please. This gets important because of what it says at the first piece and the last piece. The first piece is this Dhaka bypass has been thinking about this for 10 years. It's been stuck for 10 years. The second bullet point, look at the second line. This is on a PPP basis. First ever done on a PPP basis in Bangladesh. And the last bullet point is what you were saying before, the linkages to this from Chattanooga Port into India's northeastern. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
This is what you precisely what you were saying before. So when it was first launched, what you were talking about, that corridor, there was lots of resistance, whether it's Myanmar resistance or Indian resistance. Now you're seeing this actually linking. It's just taken almost 10 years to do that.
Yeah.
Multilateral loans is the next page, and we want to show that here. Again,
yeah, there are also misperceptions we have seen in other countries about Chinese debt and debt trap and all these stories.
I'll leave that to your capable hands to
Okay.
handle and economic. Here we want to show basically that there are multilateral loans granted to Bangladesh over 2021, 80% COVID related, 20% not infrastructure related. But if you go to the next page, look how it was split. AIB, first to AIB, then ADB, and then ADB again, and then Korea ADB.
That's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
Thank you. And then the ADB, of course, the Asian Development Bank. Yes, and then the Korean Exchange Bank, and then Japan's JICA. So see how this is not, and even AIB, as you know, Hussein, is only 26% controlled by China, has over 100 shareholders, country shareholders.
Sure.
So again, huge misperception about how much influence China has in this. Yes, ADB actually led this, Asian Development Bank led this, which is very favorable towards the West, as you know.
Yeah.
So again, to show you balance, yes, Korea, Japan, and I think there's even something in here in the Middle East. I can't remember, maybe not this one on a different slide, but again, balance. This we want to show you how what you were talking about before about the numbers, we do focus on below FDI. That makes us different from other places because large consultancy firms, banks, etc., focus on FDI. And we focus on this because this is growth capital. Yes, and so as you see in 2018, 2019, 2018 actually is in a way doesn't really show you the real numbers. That's the correct number of deals. That's much higher volume because there were two stakes.
That's the number of deals. Okay, this is not about amount of money invested.
Yes, but the amount of money, that's correct. But the amount of money invested in 2018 was much bigger because these were both takeovers by China, Chinese companies. So these are basically venture capital deals you'll see in the next page. We get to it. But what I show you, go back for a second before we go, I want to show you the volume. Look what's happened attracting venture capital. And how this worked is the government addressed this by building a fund to seed young venture capital startups. And they seed one of those funds seeded 11 of those, and another one of those funds seeded 4 of those. But those 49 will ultimately go through the capital market system, yes, and become growth businesses throughout the country. So that's a pretty major change in the last 4 years. And it works that way because the stock exchanges work that way, which we come on to in a few minutes. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this shows you your actual values in the light blue, the same. And you can see as the year progressed, more and more capital. The number of deals was pretty much flat by quarter, but as the year progressed, more and more capital came into the country in terms of growth capital for these businesses. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. Here, we just want to show you how small most of these still are. So if you look at the fourth, 1, 2, 3, fourth, look at the amounts. You'll see the amounts are quite small, $1.25 million, $1 million, less than $1 million. You see the numbers. So most of these are still seed, small seeds. So these are still early days growth companies. But as they get bigger and bigger, they'll attract more and more capital. But at least they're funded, yes, and they're growing. They're the future. No more garment. Nothing on here garment, right? Mm-hmm. Technology, energy, renewables, fintech, all future. This is how they build your future. Yeah. So there were 2 takeouts, one in education, yes, and one in e-pharmacy, one in healthcare. So you can see the future is not how the country has been run historically. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. This 5 years ago, this didn't exist. There were no venture capital investors, none in Bangladesh. Look at this. Look at the names. Singapore, India, UAE, World Bank, USA, Netherlands, these are big names that suddenly found Bangladesh and are making a lot of money out of it, and will make even more in the future if we go to the next few slides. But these are world-class investors. Here's what's happened in the stock exchange. So look where they were in 2017 with 7 deals and only 219 crore local currency. And you've seen it 7 times that amount, double the volume, and 20 times the amount in terms of issuance. Incredible, right? And if you look at the last 2 years alone, look at the size difference. This, yes, double again. Yes, for this, we'll talk about this in a second to show you how they've accelerated it. If you look at the 4th from the right and the 5th from the right, open date versus consent date, you'll see these are, if you go back up further up, the third, the consent date and open date, the 3rd from the right and the 4th from the right, you'll see they're basically 1 month apart. This used to be several months apart. Now they've gotten it down to 1 month apart before you issue. And in July of this year, they reduced it to 2 weeks apart. So you don't have long periods of time to get these things agreed by the stock exchange, by the Securities and Exchange Commission to go to market. Number one. Number two, look at the second column in oversubscription. There's a huge demand for this for these assets. In fact, arguably way too much demand. And so therefore they changed the demand a bit in the last column, which is the employee investment. So in essence, since mid-December, the 3 at the bottom, basically 15% is locked up with their employees and have to hold it for 2 years. So they can't buy their shares and just flip them. Therefore, you have false ratings on oversubscription numbers. But it locks employees in, employee ownership. Again, a huge change. And again, I want to highlight, if you look on the left, second from the column on the left, banking, insurance, life insurance, banking, insurance, non-life insurance, banking. These are the ones that had, in essence, to IPO, because the funds were then used to build an domestic institutional management business. You saw before the international side interested. This helps build the domestic institutional side. It was genius. It took a lot of courage from the finance minister to say, either you privatize or IPO, or else you're going to lose your license. But it worked. These are major changes for a country which is almost 200 million people. Next slide, please. And despite all the things they've done, they still have a ways to go. They doubled the turnover in the first bullet point. They still have small companies. They've gone from 6 to 12 companies, over $1 billion. That's still quite small. The next piece is really crucial. Venture capital IPOs, because if you will go back to that same slide, the third bullet point, the VC IPOs, because in essence, good news travels quickly in the world. And when Kazakhstan did its IPO of Kaspi, which at one time was a 10 billion stock, and Ozone did the same with Russia, the world took notice about these two countries with their unicorns from these large IPOs. It is possible that Bangladesh has at least 3 of those to come out, if not this year, in the next year or so, to lift the visibility of Bangladesh in terms of global investors. They don't have a bond market yet. The derivatives market's not there yet, but they've made huge gains in the equity side. Next page, please. It still has some challenges facing it because it only has 2 private equity funds. There's a scarcity of land in the middle, you see, for renewable energy, but the top one is the most difficult, which is bureaucracy. And we didn't want to say something negative about this. We didn't have to, because the Japanese trade minister was quite negative, because the Japanese trade minister was complaining about wanting to invest so much money into Bangladesh, and did a piece for the Sheikha in November of 2020 with 24 complaints of things that were slowing them down or getting the money into the country. By December 2021, only 4 of those have been removed, despite meeting with the Sheikha. So there's still bureaucracy issues, which can you could call them different kind of issues, but let's leave it for bureaucracy. And sorry, I always end my presentations with this phrase of mine, because I always believe we are one people, one planet, and the most important things on the planet are health and green. So thanks for permitting me to do that little advert.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I mean, this is a lot of details. People can go to your website if they want to know more and get the. Uh, this was like a very quick review of things. If we will have the website of your China investment research. My question is, what does this imply? I'm from the old school. I look at infrastructure, industries, agriculture, water management, power production as the criteria I follow. But what does these incremental, so to speak, small investments mean? The other question is also, what is the role of the Bangladeshi people, especially the Bangladeshi people in diaspora, which is a large number of people. They might have some capital where they want to invest.
Right. Let me take each of those separately. So on the first piece in infrastructure, I think you will have seen whether it's Japanese infrastructure, Korean infrastructure, or Chinese infrastructure, all the things you've talked about are on the either have been built or in the process of being built over the next couple of years. So the infrastructure is built or close to being built. Now the energy was built years ago through Siemens, right? Most of that, those are coal-fired power plants. But now it's all around renewables, yes, or IT. You've seen those infrastructure projects or expressways that link or bridges that link. So those are now all being addressed. There's nothing being held back for the future.
Or right? or medicine or
well, that's next. So that's next. So in the medicine side, they are one of the countries. In fact, the number 2 in the country is the chairman of the largest company in Bangladesh, which is listed in the London Stock Exchange. It's a healthcare company. It has chosen to partner with China to build Chinese vaccines in Bangladesh domestically. So it's a 50-50 joint venture or something similar to that in Bangladesh. So it will be building it there, manufacturing there, distributing there, and training people there. So you're not paying Western prices for those vaccines, for the COVID vaccines. And of course, they'll broaden to do other vaccines as well, but start with COVID vaccines. But the small stuff you're talking about, you're just referring to, those are things that are the future, right? These are growth businesses, which will grow them out of, yes, what they've done historically, which is that relying on that garment trade, because they're going to continue to lose market share to Vietnam. Yes, and they must get out of that. So they're diversifying. All those investments I showed you are areas outside of garment trade. All the investments inbound or investments of the venture capital investments or the IPOs, those are all to raise capital for growth industries. And what they have done is shown very strong performance. So I think the stock market was up 30% 2 years ago and up 20% last year. So good news travels quickly around the world that yes, they're doing several things right to attract more capital to grow those growth businesses. They're not there yet, but they've come a long way and they have addressed every issue you've raised about the various components of infrastructure. What they have not yet solved for yet is the inherent bureaucracy. You could call it other things, but right. But it's more difficult to get things in and out of the country, and it will take some time to solve, because if the Sheikh couldn't solve it for Japan in 13 months, it's going to take a little longer.
Right. The other question was on
is that helpful?
Yes, and the diaspora role.
Yes, good point. So as you know, in the UK here, there's loads of Bangladeshis that are here. They are trying to make it tax advantaged to bring the cash back into the country, and they also have programs to bring them to invest in the equity component of it. That has not gone to, I don't know where it stands today, but I could tell you back in November, it was not where they expected it to be. It hadn't flowed back the way they expected it to have done. But it's being replaced by some of the world's biggest investors. I mean, yes, Peter Thiel is one of the world's smartest venture capital investors and most successful. He's in here. Yes, because there are world-class investors that are in these shares, and maybe the diaspora just don't understand it well enough because They grew up in a different world of real estate and the stuff you're talking about, the way it used to be done. Those are gone. Those industries are not the future.
We had, the big problem in financial matters in developing nations with capital flight. Now capital might stay at home.
Well,
or
that's
attract more
come back.
capital.
Well, the whole purpose is bring them, and that's what Pakistan's doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So you'll watch reverse flows. That's
Yeah.
exactly what. So some of these countries we follow, Indonesia, Malaysia, these are very strong messages for future development, or even as you know with China, number of Chinese students that come here in the UK used to come to the UK and stay in the UK. Now they come here to the UK, get educated, go home. The growth is in emerging markets, or the growth is in China. The growth is not in the UK, yes, or in Western Europe.
No.
Near term, I don't envisage anything positive because of this, what's happening with energy and with inflation. I don't see anything changing those negative trends for some period of time, choking, if you will, European economies.
Yeah, this is a very dramatic situation we have here in Europe, especially people talk about the winters coming, energy shortages, what will happen with industries, what will happen with other services. That's a big question mark, but we can leave to future
Fair enough. I only point about growth is elsewhere.
Yeah, that's the point. We go back to the first point. You said the world is changing. Your image of nations you saw before about famine and poverty and all kinds of things, that those countries are probably changing, but we are not noticing it because the mass media, the think tanks are not really covering these matters, and therefore we are trying to do our best to give another picture of the reality which is going on there. There's an emerging world, whether in Asia, we have in Africa, and we are grateful for people like Henry Tillman and other guests we have hosted in our show to give us that in-depth knowledge. Thank you very much, Henry.
We'll be back with Malaysia in a couple of months, okay, when it's done.
That's a promise.
That's a promise.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much for being with us.
Always a pleasure with you, working with you, Hussein. Thank you so much.